Okay, so Caroline, welcome again here in Prague, and I want to ask you a few things about your experience and some things that you could, you wish to share with our Czech families and Czech carriers here. So one of the things I would like to ask you is simply why you started to do so many things. What was the motivation for you to start building so many organizations and services for your son and for other people with intellectual disabilities? Where did you find this energy?
Okay, so the reason behind getting involved in lots of different things, and it feels now 33 years on, lots of different things, but at the time it's just been about the block in the journey. So I had my son in 1988. By the early 90s we started to realise that he didn't necessarily fit into the system, and so we started to kind of use traditional and the pathway that was set out for people, but I kind of felt it wasn't quite enough. And for Joseph, because he survived meningitis, he had of his day a disability that hadn't been really seen, although now quite common to see somebody not dissimilar to him. So he didn't fit into the provision that was there, be that education or health services, or even holiday clubs and the surrounding things that you need to be able to work as a parent as well. So initially decided from his perspective to do some home education with him, and followed a programme from the British Institute of Brain Injured Children, and that I suppose gave me confidence to actually believe in what I felt was right, so also kind of the autonomy to take control. And I think that's what a lot of families struggle with, because we are waiting for the state system to tell us what to do. And I was feeling by the time my son was 3 to 5 years that actually we're all in the same boat, nobody really knew, so we have to pave the way ourselves. So I did that, and then things like inclusion was very important to me. So I had 3 children, so I didn't want a situation where I had to take one child here and the other child here. So developing, and I became involved in an inclusive play scheme and inclusive holiday clubs, which made a huge difference, enabling me to go to work. I then got involved in, all by default, nothing really planned, but the real big critical piece was what was going to happen beyond education, and being able to pave that way individually for him, but also using that story to help others. And that's where I became involved in a local charity, but also then to influence change nationally and internationally. And then by changing the law of the land and influencing change, that was to actually give people autonomy and choice over their personal budget. If there wasn't anything to buy with the money, that was a problem too. So I ended up coming back to actually how can we create different opportunities. And the latter end with setting up my life has been the hardest thing to be able to do. Because you learn that it's very hard to deliver high quality, person-centered support to lots of different people with lots of different views, and you can only do it person by person. And energy, I have no idea. You're just you're motivated to do it. Energy-wise, I think I believe that, well, if I can't do it, I shouldn't be expecting other people to do that as well. So, and the thing that people will say about me is that I get an idea and I don't believe it's not possible. So I just want to kind of drive it forth. Yeah.
Yeah. So that probably would make you successful in your journey.
Yeah.
What would you say that was the most helpful things or people or events that allow you to arrive where you are today? I mean, if you can, think about 2 or 3 things that really, were the motor for that.
So one of the critical things for me was I did a family leadership course called Partners in Policymaking, which was actually the first course to run in the UK that had been imported from North America. And this was in early 90s, possibly about 1995, so the internet really wasn't about. Suddenly people were giving you information that was relevant and up to date, where previously we'd not had any of that type of information. And information not just about the kind of condition of somebody or what to expect, but actually how to use different tools, particularly around person-centered thinking, to think about having a dream or a goal and an aspiration to work towards. And I think it almost felt previous to that, this is your lot, where this kind of aspirational idea of using some of the person-centered planning tools to actually say you can have a dream, you can do things differently, and actually the journey will be different, but if you drive it forward, you'll probably get some better outcomes. And I think that type of thinking really resonated with me, in that to actually say that there are no barriers in your way, but you've got to find a way through it. Also, I think critically, a second thing was, quite early on when Joseph was quite young, I described, as many families do, as fighting the system. And I couldn't understand why we had to fight, and you kind of looked at that being a personal, individual thing. So I decided to go and work for the system and understand what it was like on the inside. And actually, what I realised is most people are good people trying to do a decent job, but actually trying to change a system and is harder to change it when you're in it than when you're out of it. And to actually think about the way that change happens is paint a picture of how it should be. And I think I learned a lot with that tell people about possibility and how this could look, so they're part of the change process as well. So another tip, make people think it was their idea and they'll like it, so that kind of skill. And I think in terms of infrastructure and support, obviously I'm from a really tight-knit family in many ways, and my husband doesn't come to the fore, but he's kept things going when I've been doing lots of different things. So I think that is really critical. But also the journey was never just about Joseph, it was about my other 2 children too, that enabled them to continue to flourish and live the life that they chose, because the ultimate goal is all my 3 children are living independently, but our family. And Joseph isn't a burden to my other 2, so that was important. So it's really, I suppose, setting your sights out for the vision and not being afraid to look to the long-term future, because I think a lot of people are so frightened of that, they just bury their head in the sand.
Yeah. So what would you advise to our families? Where they should start with? What should be the first step they should think about or do something? What would you suggest?
Yeah, and I think it's really a difficult one, but I think what I would say to families, you've got one of 2 choices. You can either plan or be planned for. And if you choose to plan for, you will start to drive yourself forward in a positive way, rather than thinking everything's really difficult and it's too much. So I think one of my critical lessons learned is to really think about, what do you want to happen in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, if you kind of bear to look that far. I think the other thing that families need to do is to listen to other families, to go out and find as many people as they can who have trodden this path before, and see what they have done and what outcomes their children and young people have achieved. and you may like a bit from that person and a bit from that person, and that will start to help you realise what those goals and aspirations are. And even if you listen to things or read things or go meet people and you don't like the sound of it, at least you know not what you don't want.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it's important that you, even if you can't really get that picture in terms of the dream, start to go out and listen to people. And I did a lot of that, and the Partners in Policy Making course helped me with that. And what I found is lots of people told me what they've done, and that's how we need to work that out with families. So I have the same conversations with the same people with families not dissimilar.
Okay, that's interesting to hear, of course. Maybe you mentioned earlier, like it's a challenge to offer good quality support and make sure that your quality of life is well managed and well supported. How did you manage to prepare the staff who is supporting people? Are you training them especially in your organization? Are you, because you were not satisfied by the way people were trained at university or at school? How do you manage to have the quality you want in your service?
So critically, we can't not mention that the role, the job, the career of people supporting people with disabilities is very undervalued and very underpaid.
Yeah.
So in our country, it's probably the most underpaid job going. Mm-hmm. So one of the challenges is how do you attract, because what you see is because the job is paid so minimally, and we do have the minimum wage in the UK as well, that when another organisation offers a few pennies more, people will jump. So the attrition rates of people staying in jobs is very, very limited because people move around. So we have to think differently. We also have to think about how do we create a different culture, a different culture that really sees each individual for who they are and actually learns how to support and facilitate people to live a good life. And so one of the critical things we did, and I mentioned this yesterday, was this pathways to employment, finding people who've never worked in the sector before, to give them some ideas and some insights to what the role could be, for us to actually understand who those people are and their values, spending 5 full days with them before we even go down an interview process, to see in some of the basics, do they turn up on time and do they stick at what they say they're going to do? Because there is a lot of what I would describe as fickle people who don't stick at jobs. And then once we start to get to know people, we start to then think about the roles and responsibilities that we have. And the matching into that job is absolutely critical. So we have worked with people and we don't get it right all the time, but when we match and we think deeply about what does this person require, what are the skill sets of this person, and can they just get on? We can teach them the rest. And so that is something we've spent a lot of time doing. So we go out and we find people, we then take them through a recruitment process and we induct people and we invest in their journey in terms of training and development. So we look at where the competencies are and where the competencies need to be, and we invest from anything on a journey that is theory of why around an individual that they're supporting. So it's not just your mandatory stuff, it's getting really into detail, using an essential lifestyle plan for that individual person to look at what competences they need for their staff. And it might be things like good sense of humour, it could be anything, it doesn't have to be a skill set, or it could be a delegated healthcare task. So we look at the theory and then we have a process of how we model, introduce and coach people to actually making those observations and assessments to are they competent and confident in what they're doing, but also continuing to quality assure that to ensure that they keep the levels of competence up, because complacency is worse. So it's a challenge, and it's investing in teams. So even though somebody may have a team working with them, those members of the team never actually come together as a team. They're passing on shifts and things like that. So we invest in bringing people together. We invest in team building days. We invest in career pathways for each person, and trying to get down to the detail through appraisal and individual kind of one-to-one supervisions. What is it that motivates that worker? And different things will motivate different people.
Yeah.
So some people may want to do further qualifications, some people may be interested in the money, some people might be interested in his added benefits to doing different things. So we try to work out what the motivation is, but we see it as a vocation and a career opposed to just a carer.
Yeah. Yeah. It looks like you're doing person-centered planning with your staff.
We are. It is, because you can't begin to.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, it can't work for the people if it doesn't work for the staff.
Yeah,
And it's bringing that together.
Makes sense.
And it's hard. It's really hard, and it isn't everybody's cup of tea, as we say.
Yeah.
It might be. Some people find it more difficult, and then the other big element is for every person we support, we look at the budget around that person and ensure that that money is being spent in the most effective way possible. So some of the managers and the registered managers have got not only a duty of care to keep that person healthy, safe and well, do what matters, give them a good life, but also manage that finance to ensure that we can demonstrate to any funder that for this amount of money you get these sorts of outcomes.
So there is one more thing that came now to my mind when you were talking about that. Could you describe, and feel free to use an example if that might be easier, how does it work, like for one person who is supported in his or her living apartment or wherever the person lives, how many people may support that person, and how is the management of that support? You mentioned a little bit about the time, but how does that work? Because that's a big struggle often when the families have to do this. So how do you manage?
So we developed the model because families do struggle in taking the money and managing it, and that isn't sustainable in the long term. So what we've tried to do is to create the same outcomes around an individual, but it has to then fit into a regulated system. So in our country, if you employ your own staff, like I do with Joseph, I don't fit under regulation, as in a quality checker, but I do fit under making sure that the money's spent appropriately, and I'm audited around that. So it's slightly different. If you're an organisation providing personal care to a person, you have to be regulated with another body called the Care Quality Commission. So the standard of that have what we call key lines of inquiry, that they will monitor you and check up and inspect you on that basis. So we've got to make sure that we've got to understand the regulation, we've got to understand the financial regulation, and we've also got to kind of take the person-centred stuff into account as well. So you've got to kind of work it out on an individual basis. So each person has an assessment of need, and technically they should have an allocation of funds based on how much support and what levels of support that person would need. We may go into discussion and negotiation with the funding body, but we'll get to a place where they have decided or not that this is the support that will be provided, it will cost this amount per hour, and there'll be these levels of people. So for example, it might be that somebody has 24/7 support with 2-to-1 support for 14 hours in the day, a waking night at night. There'll be different rates, so we would have to employ a team of waking night staff and day staff. For some people, it might be some people just have one person for 8 hours a day. Yeah, so it's all different levels according to the need of that person. So what we do is we specifically recruit for that person. Now if it's a family already employing people, we might take those people on if that works. And we specifically recruit around that person and we build up the team around that person to suit. We don't necessarily get it right all the time first off, but we're knowing what we're doing. Each team around a person, so a team around a person could be 2 people, 1 or 2 people to a team of 12.
Yeah.
It depends on the levels. That team only works with that person.
Okay.
By majority, yeah? And so they're specifically recruited and they work with them. So they are the core team around that person who are fully trained around that person. Then we have a peripatetic team who are also skilled around that person, but they do quality assurance as well. So the peripatetic team would backfill in an emergency or in a planned member of staff being off, to ensure that that individual is familiar with that worker. And whilst they're working, they're quality assuring at the same time. So it doesn't feel like an inspector, it feels natural. So we pay the peripatetic team a bit higher rate, and we also negotiate a decent rate. So all of our staff are paid above the minimum wage, but some are paid higher than others depending on the need and the competence level of those people. So each team has a team manager who oversees them. Depending on the complexity of the team, they may have a team leader that works within the team, who has some administrative time to do things like the rotas and kind of make sure the paperwork's up to date, etc. We are introducing an electronic rostering system as well, because trying to get timesheets of people and accuracies around that is really quite difficult. So we are currently onboarding and trialling a version that we've developed, and that should have all be rolled out by the end of June. So let us see. Okay, so that's a tool that we've developed. And that will bring out much more efficiencies. It also has things like a GPS system on it to make sure that people are where they say they are as well. So we're trying to take the headache out of the administration, and we can concentrate more on the quality of the care and the support of people, and ensuring that people do have a good life. So for some people right at the beginning, we're currently doing this with one young man at the moment, the first job isn't to find the staff, it's to find the housing for people. So we have to find the housing, and then we might have to find the staff team, and we have to do it in a kind of invested way. For some people, it can take us 18 months to build up that team because of the circumstances they may be in. And it isn't, when people are rushing things, it doesn't work as well. So it's an interesting lessons learned. We don't support that many people. We probably support about 24, 25 people. And that's been relatively steady until recently. And even just today, I've just seen via my emails that we have a demand coming in, a significant demand, which you could be easily flattered by, but you've got to go, no, you've got to slow it down, and you've got to say, are we the right organisation for this person, and are the funders going to fund appropriately so we can employ the right staff and invest properly. Because at the beginning, when you first start off something, sometimes you are quite flattered by the people that are sent, but sometimes you're sent the most complex individuals that have failed before. So some of the people that we've worked with, one young woman had 36 providers before. So we're taking on something that's quite difficult, and you've got to ask why did that happen, and there were lots of reasons why that happened. Others have had providers who just walked. And the investment of not just providing the support, but giving pastoral support to the individual, to deal with the complexities and the different nuances and demands of families can be complicated. And so for some people it works wonderfully well like a breeze, and for other people it's a lot more difficult to work with. So it isn't just the funds that you need to support the person, it's all the other infrastructure that we put in place too. And that is usually the most difficult bit.
Yeah. One thing, because you mentioned also earlier that you've managed to change the legislation at the level of your region or nationally you managed. Okay. How did that happen?
Okay. So in terms of changing legislation, so right at the beginning we did an early pilot in Wigan. And what was important about the pilot that we did, it was led by the chief exec of the local council. So he could command everybody within that council, whether it rightly or wrongly, to do this and put attention to it. And that was critical to test something out.
Yeah.
As a chief exec of a relatively decent sized council, he was quite well respected amongst peers. So then he could go and tell others what he'd done. So that position that he had was quite critical to transfer that learning in other places. And when you're leading a council, you get the opportunity to network not just peers, but lots of other people. And one of the critical people that he networked with was a guy called Charles Leadbeater, who has written a lot of early stuff on personalisation and personalised approaches. And by chance, the chief executive happened to be at a dinner sat next to him. And then he came. So you think, well, how does this stuff work? And in a way you couldn't plan it. He came to Wigan and saw what we'd done in that early pilot. So then he goes and tells lots of other people. And at that time, Charlie Leadbeater had set up Demos, which was a think tank for the government and was a significant think tank for the Tony Blair government. So knowing the right people in the right places can get you into the right audiences. And so from that, at the time we developed quite a few, the great and the good, if you like, who were really understanding about inclusion. People who've been involved in the inclusion movement set up a charity called In Control. And Simon Duffy led some of that. He's the philosopher, done a lot of work around the big brain thinking on how this should actually work. And I guess with the theory, but also Simon had been involved in actual practice as well, and testing that out, and people like myself who could actually describe the story. And we just went in front of audience after audience of influence and change makers, telling them how good they were and how good things could be if more people did this. And the story was positive, that for the same amount of money, and in some cases less, we were getting far better outcomes for people. And everybody wants to hear that. So people wanted to do more, so we tested out and did more pilots, and In Control then started to drive the different pilots across the country. But in quite a relatively short space of time, the government started to listen and put together the dovetail pieces of legislation. It was the Children and Families Act and the Care Act, which was the first time you've got a children and an adults piece that actually linked together, because transition was a big problem, obviously. And that came to be. And that gave the right for people to have choice and control and autonomy and an advocate and all them important things. The hard bit then, and you think, oh, if only we could change the legislation, it would change the world. It doesn't. So you've got the change of legislation, but it takes a decade or so to embed. And of course, we've been affected by the pandemic as well, so it'll slow things down. And they actually took off some of the directive from that legislation during the pandemic, so it's bringing that back in now, and driving that for change. But also, we've had 2 years of families really struggling without any support services, particularly things like respite have been, people haven't had a break, people are tired. And so to then ask people to drive change, they're just tired. I think we need to have some recovery time for people as well.
Yeah, I think that's a common situation everywhere. So just my very last question, what are your next battles? What do you still want to change or achieve? I'm sure you have something here in your mind.
I think the hardest thing for me, I mean, care and support is difficult enough. But we were asked to provide further education to young people 16 to 25, preparing for adulthood. And we have a very harsh regulatory system in the UK, rightly so, that looks at lots of evidence of how you are working with somebody towards some kind of vocation and the outcomes. And that is really hard to do.